Hey guys, I am here at Heritage Arms in Midvale, Utah, and we are going to take a look at some Egyptian military firearms, starting from the oldest here up to the newest. So Egypt has a pretty interesting history when it comes to their national identity and sort of outside influence on them. Egypt got their sort of independence from the Ottoman Empire in the early 1800s. And like most, nations of the time, they used muskets and stuff like that. Now, around the time that Remington introduced their rolling block rifle, everyone kind of went crazy for it, including Egypt. And Egypt made an order for the rifles in 1868, and they actually delayed their order because the French needed guns. So the Franco-Prussian War kicked off around 1870, and Egypt sort of defaulted on their rifles so that the rifles meant for them could go to the French, which was one of their allies. So a lot of the Egyptian rolling blocks went to the French to fight the Prussians, and the French actually produced 43 Egyptian ammo in France for their Egyptian rolling block rifles, and they continued to produce their rounds after the war and kept the rifles in service. And then it was later in the 1870s when Egypt actually got their order of rolling blocks, and they put them to pretty good use in the expansion of Egypt that they went through around that time. Long story short, Egypt had a sort of problem with rebels, and they lost to the rebels. And when they did that, the British sort of moved in to take control of the Suez Canal area so that they could, look after their interests in the Suez Canal. Because the Suez Canal offered a much quicker route for the British to go to India. So instead of having to go, down around the tip of Africa, the southern tip of Africa, and go up to India, they could just go through the Suez Canal. So they had to look after their interests. So they sort of occupied Egypt without Egypt becoming really like a territory, like a formal territory. So Egypt remained under British control mostly through World War I, when the British really occupied it with military force, and then through World War II. So in the 1940s, Egypt was looking to get a new firearm for their military service, and they became interested in the FN-49. So Egypt, they made an order in 1948 for a few FN-49s, and they ended up getting about 37,000 of FN-49s. Now the earlier ones, like this one, will have a crown on it. That was for the king at the time, the monarchy. But after the revolution in 1952, instead of the crown, they put a eagle for the new government. Egypt had these FN-49s. They were in 8mm Mauser. Pretty much, I think just most about everyone that had these guns really liked them. They're a pretty cool design. It's a fixed magazine. It's loaded with stripper clips. And but the Egyptians, they really weren't too crazy about it. I suspect that the Egyptians, they didn't like the fact that they didn't have domestic production of these guns, because these Egyptian FN-49s were made in Belgium. And the Egyptians were looking for a bit more of, they wanted to produce their own guns for themselves. And they also wanted to be a sort of a firearms maker for the whole Middle East, so that if other Arab countries or if other countries wanted to buy guns that were in that neighborhood, they could go to Egypt for their guns. So Egypt then started looking around for another type of semi-automatic firearm that they could develop in Egypt, and they went to the Swedes. They went to Switzerland. They saw they knew about the Jungmann rifle that had been out since the 40s, and the time period that we're in now is probably in the 1950s. So the Egyptians are looking at getting their own sort of copy of the Jungmann and getting the machinery to make it themselves, which is the important part to them. So they got a license to make a Jungmann copy from the Swedes, and they also get the machinery to make it domestically. So what you have here is the Egyptian Hakim that came out of that. This rifle features some of the features of the later Jungmanns, and sort of tailored to more what the Egyptians wanted in a rifle. So the Egyptians, they produced these in the 1950s for themselves. Again, this is in 8mm Mauser. So around this time, the Egyptians, they could kind of see the writing on the wall. They could see that the big calibers like 8mm Mauser, they're kind of going out of style. Everyone's sort of going towards these, the intermediate cartridges. And the Egyptians were in the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. So they started looking at a lot of Soviet guns. They started looking at the SKS and the 7.62x39 round, and they kind of wanted to make something of their own like that. So I don't have one here, but what they came up with was a Hakim, basically in 7.62x39. That's pretty close in size to an SKS, and they had that for a little while. They only made a few thousands of those. Those aren't too common on the American market. But you could see the direction that they were going towards. They were going towards an intermediate round, and I think they sort of realized before producing too many of the Rashids that they needed to go to something more modern than just a clip-loaded, semi-automatic only style rifle. So the Egyptians, they started cozying up to the Russians, and they were able to get some machinery in order to make their own AK-47s. So they got Russian machinery, and they even got Russian armorers and advisors to come over and teach them how to make the AKs for themselves. And so what the Egyptians made is just really standard run-of-the-mill AKM. This one here is an Egyptian, the only difference being that the actual military ones were full auto and they had wood on it. And this one has American furniture on it to be 922R compliant. But the Egyptians, they ended up going to the AKM with the Soviet Union, and they produced these guns with the Soviets until 1972. And they kicked the Soviets out, and then they just kind of been making them ever since at the same factory. Actually, their AKs and their Hakims were made in the same factory. It was Factory 54, which was renamed the Maadi factory, which is just the name of where it's at in Egypt, in Cairo. Now, there are other firearms that the Egyptians had in between, say, the rolling block and the FN-49, but a lot of those firearms, they were sort of from outside sources. The British would give them Martini Henrys and Enfields and stuff like that, but they weren't so much their own guns. Egypt didn't really go out and seek those for themselves. These are the firearms that an independent Egypt actually went out and purchased for themselves and wanted. So this is a pretty interesting snapshot of the mindset that they were going through at the time. They went through a pretty long battle rifle stage where they wanted these, the heavy-hitting 8mm Mauser rifles. And then they sort of jumped straight from the Hakim into the AK-47s. So I appreciate your watching. If you would, please subscribe. That helps me out, and I'll see you next time.